government has a number of options available to it to address the BEPS proposals. I would say both regulatory as well as legislative. Let me start with the regulatory. So I think that's, in theory, the path of least resistance, although it has its challenges. As part of the government, in particular the executive branch's regulatory authority to administer the law as enacted, of course, the IRS could review the transfer pricing rules to determine whether or not there are additional measures that they can do to tighten down, for example, the arm's length standard that exists in Section 482. That's one of the things that the government could do, and that would be in line with sort of the larger premise of BEPS. So that's on the regulatory side. On the legislative side, of course, you have legislative authority to write virtually any rule you want, but that's not easy either, and you probably won't be surprised to hear that Congress, under its current makeup and functionality, is having trouble getting any tax legislation done. So that's no easy task either. But there's a couple of paths, I think, in the legislative arena where you could see some BEPS proposals. Let me start with perhaps the one that is most likely to result in a comprehensive BEPS kind of package being implemented into law. And that would be in the context of tax reform itself. You have seen the Senate act in tax reform through then Chairman of the Senate Finance Committee Baucus's international tax proposals, had base erosion proposals in there. And you saw Chairman Dave Camp on the House side, Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, introduce his bill that also had base erosion proposals. So there you have it, bipartisan consensus that in the context of tax reform, perhaps we could do some sort of base erosion legislation. Fair enough, except that I think it's questionable whether or not we will see tax reform anytime soon. This is 2014. It's a midterm election year. Unlikely to see anything this year. And in 2015, probably by the middle of 2015 anyway, we'll be beginning a presidential election season. So there is a very small window, really, in theory, of tax reform happening in 2015, and probably unlikely to happen in 2015. And of course, we carry through to 2016, and then to 2017, we'll have a new president in 2017. He or she may not make tax reform a priority in the first term. If they did, that would certainly challenge our historical context of what presidents are willing to do. So tax reform, while it's one path, seems to be an unlikely one. A second option available from a legislative point of view is really, I suppose, that the Congress could simply take up the OECD recommendations and put them up for a vote in the Senate and the House to see what would happen. I think that outcome, or at least the possibility of that either happening or passing, is unlikely for a couple of reasons. Almost inevitably, the United States Congress would take the OECD package and probably tinker with it to try and make an improvement here or a modification there. And so that in itself creates complexity between the House and the Senate, Republicans and Democrats. So that is one complicating factor. A second is that I think the reality is that at the moment, the U.S. business community is not wholly supportive yet of what the OECD has been doing around BEPS. An example of that is not too long ago, the Business Roundtable wrote a letter to the OECD, really casting doubt about what the OECD is doing, at least from the BRT's perspective. So I think that there could be some resistance to simply taking the OECD package, putting it on the floor, and putting it up to a vote. So I don't really see that as the likely outcome. So where does that leave us? I don't want to leave you all with the impression that that means that we need not worry about BEPS. It won't become law in the U.S. Congress is too dysfunctional or not interested. That is a little too simplistic of a view. So there are other paths, I think, by which at least some of these proposals could become law. Perhaps by pieces, or as BEPS by bits, as some commentators have called it, where a provision here, a provision there could become law. And I'll give you a good example. Right now, at the moment here in the U.S., the topic of corporate inversions is really the hot topic that Congress and commentators are focused on. And it goes back to my point that, really BEPS is in the eye of the beholder. While many countries may not be worried about inversions at the moment, the U.S. is very concerned about it. And it's really base erosion writ large, if you think about it. So could Congress act on inversion legislation and do something that would really fit into the broader schematic of BEPS? And I think the answer is yes. I think we are starting to see some bipartisan support for some sort of legislation around inversions. So what might that look like? Well, I think there's a good chance that any suggestion that Congress ultimately comes up with to deal with the inversion problem could include a proposal to prevent interest stripping, or 163J as we have it here in the U.S. So, of course, 163J is intended to prevent interest stripping out of the U.S., stripping income out of the U.S. for multinationals. And it's quite possible that Congress could act to enhance the current law under 163J. And so this year it might be inversions, next year it might be something else. So you could, over time, get pieces of a BEPS kind of package here in the U.S. And then there's really a last possibility, and you call it BEPS by default, if you will, that imagine, if you will, the rest of the world acts on the OECD's recommendations. That, for example, our major trading partners and major countries in the G20 and the OECD have enacted either all of or in large part of what the OECD recommends. You may find that Congress finds it to be, in that case, much easier or even necessary to adopt BEPS for a couple of reasons, I suppose. One of which is if multinationals find that the environment that they're dealing in is an environment where the BEPS rules are in place virtually everywhere else, they may find it non-offensive if Congress simply acts and just implements the BEPS proposals. Furthermore, you might even find a scenario under which they're asking Congress to enact them, if for no other reason than to provide consistency in terms of rules around the world as it relates to these cross-border transactions. And finally, if the U.S. finds that as the last holdout on BEPS, that they are really the loser in terms of tax planning, that other jurisdictions, companies are using the U.S. to extract income out of the U.S., then ultimately the U.S. may be forced to act on BEPS as well. So, you know, in all those scenarios, I do believe it is possible that we could get some of these BEPS types proposals, you know, maybe not as part of tax reform in the short term, maybe not just by simply enacting the OECD's proposals outright, but through these other pathways that I think are quite plausible.